Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story is a quiet one, the kind that doesn't begin with a scream, but with a room. A room some families avoid, a room some families protect, and a room that remembers everything you wish it didn't. If you've ever walked into an old house and felt the air shift, felt the walls listening, then you already know the kind of place we're stepping into. So sit back, dim the lights, and let the rain outside your window be the only sound you hear. Because tonight, we're going to a hanok where grief isn't just kept, it's reflected. And once we start, every step will lead us deeper into the mourning room and toward a mirror that should have stayed covered forever. Now, let's begin. They kept the mirror in the mourning room at the back of my grandmother's hanok, facing the wall where the morning light never reached. If you stood in the courtyard during the rainy season and looked through the paper doors, you could see its cloth covering hanging like a shadow that had learned to stay still. The fabric was raw silk, undyed, wrapped 7 times around the frame and tied with hemp cord that smelled of sesame oil and something older, the kind of scent that makes you remember rooms you've never entered. My grandmother said it had been her mother's before the occupation, and her mother's mother's before the war that nobody won. She also said, the summer I came back to help prepare for Chuseok, that it was not for looking into, but guilt, when it grows heavy enough, seeks its own reflection. When my mother died, I was teaching English in Busan, living in an efficiency apartment where the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbor's television dramas through the plaster. I told myself I would come for the funeral, that the semester could wait, that my students would understand. But the morning I was meant to catch the bus, my supervisor called an emergency meeting about curriculum changes. I told myself it was only 1 day, then it was 2. By the time I arrived in Seoul, the funeral hall was empty except for the ajumma, who cleaned the ribbon petals from the floor and asked if I was family. My aunt's voice on the phone was steady when she told me they had buried my mother in the family plot on the hillside, that they had called my name 3 times at the gravesite and waited between each calling. But the earth does not pause for traffic or meetings or the small cowardices we dress up as obligations. I carried that absence through the summer, like a stone you keep in your pocket until it wears a hole. When autumn came and the persimmons began to ripen on the trees behind my grandmother's house, I asked if I could help prepare for the ancestor rites. She looked at me with the expression she reserves for rain that arrives too late for the planting, nodded once, and told me to air out the morning room. Then she handed me the key to the back hall and said to be careful with the window latches, because they had rusted from years of being opened only when absolutely necessary. The path to the morning room follows the edge of the courtyard, past the stone water basin where my grandfather used to wash his hands before prayer, past the persimmon tree whose branches tap the roof tiles when the wind argues with itself. A wooden sign near the door frame requests that visitors remove their shoes. Below it, faded Hanja characters spell out something about respect that I learned to read too late to use properly. The afternoon bus from Dongdaemun stops at the neighborhood entrance near the convenience store, and at 4 o'clock, the apartment loudspeakers announce recycling schedules and remind everyone about the community center's free health screenings. On the afternoon I took the key, the sky had that September clarity that makes every tile edge look freshly cut. I unlocked the door and found everything I remembered from childhood. The low table with the lacquer worn soft, the silk cushions for kneeling, the incense holder shaped like a lotus, the wooden name tablets stacked by generation. And behind these, against the back wall, where the plaster had learned to hold its breath, stood the mirror. The cloth around it was wound so tightly that the frame seemed to disappear into the fabric itself. The hemp cord crossed at 7 points, each intersection marked with a small paper tag bearing a Chinese character I did not recognize. The silk did not move when I opened the window. That stillness unsettled me more than any draft could have. As I lifted the cushions to beat the dust from them outside, one of the paper tags peeled at its corner. Not from moisture, but like skin remembering how to shed. It brushed my wrist. The touch was cooler than paper should be, and when I drew my arm back, a single silk thread clung to the small hairs there. I raised my arm to the courtyard light, and the thread gleamed with a faint iridescence, like oil floating on water. It would not brush away. When I pinched it between my fingers to pull it free, it resisted with the gentle insistence of a child who has not yet learned that holding on can hurt. When it finally released, it lay across my palm with the weight of a whispered promise. I set it on the windowsill, and it stuck to the wood as though it had been waiting for exactly that surface. I swept the floor. The broom handle grew warm in my hands, not from friction, but from some quality of the room itself. My grandmother brought me cold barley tea and apologized for the heat in the back hall during autumn, as if she had personally negotiated with the seasons and come away with terms less favorable than she would have preferred. She asked if I would stay the night before the rites, as I had when I was small, and my mother would fall asleep with her hand on my shoulder, keeping me from wandering toward the mirror in my dreams. I told her no, that I would return in the morning and help arrange the offering table, and she nodded, repeating that the mirror should remain covered. She spoke not in prohibition, but in the voice of someone trying to protect a door from being opened by people who do not know what doors remember. Evening comes to the hanok the way old grief returns to a house that has tried to renovate itself, not with drama, but with a quiet insistence. The swallows under the eaves settle into their conversations about distance and direction. The courtyard stones release the day's heat slowly, as though reluctant to let go of the sun's brief attention. I sat on the floor before the covered mirror, folded my legs the way my mother had taught me when I was young enough to believe that proper posture could prevent sorrow, and placed my palm flat against the silk. I did not unwrap the cord. I did not remove the paper tags. I did not try to look beneath the covering. I only sat with my hand against the fabric and felt my heartbeat change its rhythm to match something patient and waiting inside. Under my palm, the silk was cold. Not the cold of fabric kept from light, but a deeper temperature, as though the mirror behind it had learned to maintain a climate of its own and was slowly teaching my hand to accept it. I spoke my mother's name, not loudly, because morning rooms keep sounds the way wells keep water and will return them to you changed. I apologized for the days I had missed, for the calls I'd meant to make, for the visits I told myself I would schedule after the semester ended, after the promotion, after life became the shape that permits coming home. I promised to set the table correctly this year, to bow the right number of times, to call the names in order without rushing, to mean every gesture even when meaning feels performative. The silk remained cold. I felt foolish and then ashamed, and because shame demands usefulness, I stood and began arranging the cushions as though arrangement could substitute for presence. At my grandmother's house, I washed my hands and noticed, in the bathroom's fluorescent light, a thin line where the silk thread had touched my wrist. It looked like a scratch made by clean fingernails, precise and deliberate. I slept poorly and dream the dream that guilt keeps in its pocket for occasions like this. My mother at the kitchen table, waiting, the kettle boiling over because I had forgotten to turn off the stove, her name tablet sitting empty on a table I could not reach, the room growing darker while I tried to find the light switch, my hands passing through the wall where it should have been. I woke before dawn. The line on my wrist had faded to the color of old silk. The second touch came the next morning while I was dusting the name tablets. They are simple rectangles of wood, each bearing a name in black ink, whose strokes speak of the living hand that wrote them as much as the dead person they represent. My mother's tablet is new enough that the wood has not yet darkened. The characters written in my aunt's steady hand because mine had been too shaky that terrible week to be trusted with permanence. When I lifted the cloth to clean the lacquer table beneath the tablets, the same paper tag on the mirror's covering lifted slowly, like a finger calling attention without voice. This time, the silk fiber did not cling to hair. It pressed directly to skin and stayed there. When I tried to rub it away with my sleeve, it would not move. It remained, thin and cool, as though a thread had decided to grow into me. When my grandmother brought me rice and soup and saw me staring at my wrist, she told me something she framed as history and not as warning. The mirror, she said, had not always been wrapped. In her mother's time, it had hung uncovered in the mourning room, and women would look into it after the funeral rites to make sure they had not brought any wandering spirit home in their reflection. But there was a winter. She did not say which year, only that it was during the hardest cold, when a daughter looked too long, trying to see her father's face once more behind her own. The mirror had shown her something, my grandmother said, and after that, the daughter stopped speaking to anyone living. She would stand in front of the mirror and hold conversations with the empty air, nodding and weeping and laughing at jokes no one else could hear. The family wrapped the mirror then and kept it wrapped, and the daughter slowly returned to herself, though she never quite looked at reflections the same way again. Some surfaces remember too well, my grandmother said, then asked me to check whether the persimmons on the altar table were ripe enough, and left me with the shape of a story that explained nothing and everything at once. If I had been wise, I would have shown her the thread growing into my wrist. I would have explained that it did not hurt, but that its painlessness worried me in the way that numbness in a limb suggests damage deeper than sensation can report. Instead, I asked her to teach me again how my mother had arranged the offerings, which foods went in which order, which direction the spoon should face, how long to let the incense burn before beginning the bows. She placed her hands over mine and guided them slowly, the way people guide each other through rituals that are equal parts muscle memory and prayer. When she released me, the thread in my skin tightened slightly, acknowledging her touch, as though it too were learning the ceremony. At noon, I walked to the neighborhood office to register our family for the Chuseok Memorial List. There is a clipboard by the community bulletin board, one line for each family name, with columns for the number of people attending and any special requests for the shared evening meal. I wrote numbers that would have made my mother smile because they meant I was bringing my cousin's children, who she had loved for their noise and their questions. On my way out, I passed the small park where old men play jangi and discuss politics with the comfortable anger of people who have learned that outrage is a form of exercise. The thread in my wrist had darkened from clear to silver. When I returned to the hanok, my grandmother was napping. A note by the kitchen sink said she would wake before sunset, that I should prepare the fruit if I finished early, that the back door tended to stick in humid weather, and needed a firm pull to close properly. I took the key to the morning room and opened the door again. The silk covering looked darker. The hem cord seemed to have tightened, though no one had touched it. I placed both palms flat on the floor and breathed until the panic in my chest remembered it had other work to do. The cold in my wrist had become a presence, as though the thread had connected to something that wanted to live where I lived. I did not unwrap the mirror. The knots held as they had held for decades. The paper tags did not tear. The room did not fill with dramatic light or sudden cold, or any of the theatre I thought grief owed to people who arrive at understanding too late. I left the morning room to cut persimmons because the ones in the kitchen had ripened to the point where waiting another day would mean waste. At the fruit stand near the bus stop, the ajumma, who always gives me extra because she remembers my mother sold me the best persimmons and thanked me too warmly, the way people do when they are trying to push kindness past your defenses. When I stepped outside, the apartment loudspeakers announced the community center's evening Tai Chi class and reminded everyone about parking restrictions for the holiday. I stood there, persimmons in hand, thinking how ordinary the world remains when it is not paying attention to your small catastrophes. Then a vibration moved up my wrist like someone tapping Morse code against bone. There is a point when coal stops being sensation and becomes communication. In the morning room, I set the persimmons down too quickly, and the plate touched the silk covering. The paper tag lifted and pressed against my wrist again, not brushing this time but steadying me, the way you might touch someone's elbow when they sway on their feet. The thread under my skin pulled taut. A taste filled my mouth like winter air breathed too quickly, sharp and clean and faintly metallic. The cold in my wrist sharpened into clarity. I knelt and flexed my hand because the cold had intention and no interest in being misunderstood. It was not until I held my wrist up to the window light that I understood what it wanted. Beneath the skin, something had formed. Not a wound or infection, but a shape. It looked like a small oval of frost trapped under a thin membrane, delicate and intricate as ice crystals on glass. At the center sat what appeared to be a sliver of silver, not metal, but the idea of reflection crystallized into matter, as though the mirror had learned to plant a piece of itself in living tissue. Fine lines radiated from this center into the smaller veins of my wrist, like the cracks in old pottery that speak of use and time and careful repair. I felt no pain. I felt no fear in the conventional sense. What I felt was recognition, like finding a scar you do not remember earning but somehow know belongs to you. I understood then that the mirror did not want my apology. It wanted my presence, and not for dramatic purposes. It wanted to ensure I would return. The price of absence, of treating obligation as optional, of believing that grief could be rescheduled around convenience, was simple and exact. Something had to be carried by someone who would keep coming back when the persimmons ripened and the memorial dates arrived, and the morning room needed to be aired out so the dead would have a clean place to visit. I took the offering plates from their shelf and arranged them on the low table and placed my wrist flat on the cool lacquer. The frost shape under my skin grew colder until the silver sliver felt solid. It did not push outward. It rooted inward, anchoring itself to the small bones that allow the hand to gesture, to reach, to bow, to perform all the small movements that constitute care. The silk thread at my wrist tightened with the quiet authority of a suture. I felt, with a clarity I cannot pretend was mystical, a weight shift from the wrapped mirror to the space behind my pulse. The covering seemed to hang looser after that, not because the mirror had released what it was, but because it had found someone who would carry it into all the places mirrors cannot go. I set the table with that new weight humming beneath my skin. I arranged the persimmons and the rice cakes and the wine cups and called my grandmother when everything was ready. She came in leaning on her cane, saw the silver thread visible at my wrist, and said nothing because there are things women like her refuse to discuss if speaking them aloud would require admitting what they have always known. We performed the bows together. As we called each name, the cold in my wrist pulsed once, a response without language. When we reached my mother's name, I felt the silver sliver turn like a key in a lock, and the room grew briefly warmer, as though something that had been waiting outside had finally been invited in. After the rites, my grandmother wrapped leftover rice cakes in cloth and told me the mirror had been quieter this year. She did not explain what she meant by quiet or how she measured such things, and I did not ask. That night, I wrapped my wrist loosely, not to hide the thread, but to prevent myself from touching it with the obsessive attention that turns mystery into melodrama. I dreamed of my mother as I do when grief has aged enough to permit honesty, not as saint or martyr, but as a woman who once burned an entire pot of rice and laughed until she cried because perfection is exhausting. In the dream, she took my wrist gently, examined the silver beneath my skin, and nodded as though approving a choice I had made without knowing I was making it. When I woke, the cold had settled into something bearable, like a winter coat that fits well enough to forget you're wearing it. I returned for every memorial after that. When my grandmother called about Chuseok, I came. When the Lunar New Year approached, I came. When she mentioned that the mourning room needed cleaning, I came. Each time I entered that room, the paper tags on the mirror's covering lifted slightly and settled back, the way a cat acknowledges your presence without demanding attention. The silver under my skin darkened over the seasons, not growing, but deepening, like a photograph gaining contrast. On hot summer days, it cooled my wrist. On winter nights, it grew cold enough that I learned to sleep with that arm under the blanket. When I touched my mother's name tablet, the sliver would turn once, slowly, a reminder and a greeting folded together. My grandmother never asked about my wrist directly, but she began leaving me tasks that required careful handwork, folding paper lotus flowers for the altar, writing names in the memorial book with a brush, polishing the small brass bells that hang by the courtyard door. My aunt noticed the thread and asked if I had hurt myself. I told her it was a scar from carelessness, which was true in every way that mattered. My cousin's children asked why I wore a bracelet made of light, and I told them it was a gift from someone who wanted to make sure I did not get lost, which was also true. There is no triumph in this. The mirror still hangs covered, still maintains its cold patience, still remembers everything it has been asked to forget. I am only another thread in the fabric that keeps it contained. But the mourning room no longer feels like a place of punishment. The name tablets gather their dust more slowly. My grandmother says she sleeps better knowing someone will come when she is gone, that the mirror will not be left alone to remember by itself. The paper tags on the covering stay flat now, their corners no longer lifting to seek skin or attention. If you are the kind of person who wants a warning about cursed objects and family obligations and silk that clings to living skin, I have none to give. What I have is smaller and harder to carry. Do not mistake convenience for necessity, and do not mistake absence for freedom. If you broke something by not being there, go back and stand in the room where you should have stood, not for forgiveness, but so the break will have a chance to set properly. If your family performs rites and you have treated them as theatre instead of tether, go early. Ask which plate goes where. Hold the incense steady and mean it. Some debts are paid in presence, not apology. Some mirrors do not show you what you look like. They show you where you have failed to look. And if, in a quiet room, something cold chooses your wrist, do not pull away, as though you are too important for such claims. Some obligations take the form of silver under skin, because that is the only shape they can take to keep you tethered to the places that need you to return.